Okay, is it rolling, Bob? We're filming it today for the first time just to see, because a lot of people have been saying, could you put it on YouTube, because we forget some of the things that get said, so we're going to try that. So, first of all, can I welcome everybody here today? You've done well to come through the gales and the torrents outside, I'm sure. See, some of you are heavily pregnant, others with small children, and presumably others of you have left your children in the care of who knows who. So, well done. So, we're looking today at attachment and I suppose the importance of early parenting. And I was just reading the paper this week. Did you see that there was a lot of research has been done apparently, which has provided a link between guys who make good fathers and guys with small testicles. Did you see that that was in the paper this week? So can I give a special welcome to the caring fathers who have cared enough to come along today. Well done. Actually, Rachel pointed out to me and she said, "You were quite a good father." That just proves it. I don't know what she's talking about. Apparently it's a trade-off between, I suppose, guys with smaller testicles and, there's the big gorilla guys with bunches of coconuts who are only interested in reproducing and they don't care what happens after that. So I'm sure this will be touched, this idea will be touched on today. Okay, so I want to welcome our speakers today, who are this pair over here. Now, Helen I've known for a couple of years. Graham I have played in bands with for, I think, the last 75 years, Bryce, isn't it? 75 years, Bryce and me have been playing together. And I've been trying to get him to retire, like myself, over the last few years, so we can get together and just play incredibly loud electric guitars. But he keeps on getting interested in other things to do with his job, sadly. There's something going wrong. And he and Helen have been working the last couple of years. They'll maybe tell you more about it, with a group in New Orleans, sadly not a jazz group in New Orleans, but a group in New Orleans who are doing work on how to help kids who have been born into sort of chaotic home backgrounds, that sort of thing. So hopefully that'll get touched on. If it's not touched on, then you'll want to ask them about that later on, because that's dead interesting. But they're going to be talking about this importance of attachment. But as well as that, I've also invited them along because, as you know, there's always a sing-along at the start of the Glad Academy. So these people are well capable of leading that sing-along. Bryce is a good twiddler on the six strings, and Helen's got one of the finest blues voices in the west of Scotland. So I think I'm just going to hand over to them now and let them take away the rest of the afternoon, both musically and ideas-wise. So a round of applause for Helen Minnis and Graham Bryce.
Actually, Graham and I have been trying to work out what this song that we're all about to sing is really about, and we really haven't a clue. But it's vaguely on the top.
You all get the sheet? Good.
We're doing it the opposite way around, actually. We thought we'd do number 2 first.
The psychiatrist for you.
Okay, so the first song is Mother and Child Reunion, and hopefully you'll know it, and just Gail Aldi.
This such a mysterious way. The roads of a lifetime run over and over again. But I would not give you false hope, no, on a strange and mournful way. But the mother and child reunion is only a motion away.
I must say, this is the most surreal kind of presentation I've ever done, but it's, I love it. I love the surreal nature of it. Singing and then talking.
You've never been introduced by anyone who dwelt so much on the subject of testicles, have you?
No, that has to be. That has to be said. But I think it's good to just kind of get down and dirty right at the beginning.
Yeah, well, okay. So, the subject is Weans and brains, and the reason we started doing this, we've done this once before because we thought the kind of stuff that we're interested in through our work is interesting to us, but actually I think it's interesting more widely, and it does seem to me that maybe there's room to talk more about this and just get discussion going more about it. And essentially it's around the idea of what is going on for very small children, what's happening in their lives in the earliest days, and what's going on in the relationships and what are those relationships about.
I should just say as well that when we talked about this before, it was at a music festival, and it was a rainy Sunday morning, and I quite genuinely thought there'd be 6 people there. But it was packed, standing room only, and I think it's really interesting that people really do now want to hear about this. I think 5 years ago, this probably would have been empty, because I think people have started to realise how interesting young brains are.
Yeah.
Sorry, carry on.
No. So, I think the other thing is that we've been using this phrase in conversation about getting the brain out of the skull and into the community, which sounds an awful idea, and probably makes most of you, certainly the vicar, think of Steve Martin's The Man with Two Brains. But it's really to do with the idea that the brain is actually the most social of organs. Although we tend, and there's I think a history, certainly, we're both medics, right, so in the history of medicine to think of the brain as somehow bound by the skull, and so that idea of talking about brains and talking about what's going on in brains and about early development and the importance and the connections between what's going on in the brain and the emotional and relational world of the child just seems really important. So that's what we're going to be talking about. So,
and I think for me, I'm a scientist and a clinician. I do research as well, and for me, the reason I went into the scientific side of this was because I think young minds are just absolutely fascinating. And when I started in child psychiatry in the early 90s, I thought this is a discipline that's going to change in my lifetime, because I honestly think back then we were like barber surgeons. I mean, we just really didn't know what we were doing. Some people had a vague idea, but there's been just the most incredible explosion of research. And I can't remember the whole poem, but there's a poem by Emily Dickinson, and it says, "The brain is larger than the sky, for each the other contains," I think, something like that. And for me, you know, science has traditionally been about the universe and stars, but I just think that if you look into a child's mind, it's just as big as the universe, it's just as exciting.
So our starting point is really to think a wee bit about what's happening developmentally with children. And I'm going to paint a wee backcloth, which has actually been alluded to several times in Glad Academy already, because for those of you who have got full marks on your attendance card, you remember that Harry Burns spoke here way back at the start of the series. And then Karen McCluskey spoke equally memorably a few months back. And both of them talked about early years and talked about the importance of early years. And it's very much part of government policy now about investing in early years, and I won't go and talk a wee bit about why that is, but we want then to just develop what's going on in early years that everyone is so excited about it. But I want to start with the story. The idea that we're kind of discovering things and learning things and bringing a new attention to the subject of brain development might not be all that new to people. And indeed it might have in recent years become so well established as to seem self-evident. But I think Helen too heard this American paediatrician called Barry Brazelton speaking in Glasgow about a year and a half ago, and he's now a very, very senior gentleman. He's in his 80s, but he's still gigging, he's still kind of touring and telling stories. And when he was speaking in Glasgow, he spoke about when he started as a paediatrician, which would have been, 60 years ago. So those of you who can count will work out what that be. It's a post-war period, yeah. That's when he was training. He said, at that time, we thought of babies as being unable to see. And you're thinking, is that right? Is that what we thought then? And I mention that because I think it's really helpful to compare what we now know with what we thought we knew before. Because I think a whole lot of the way that we think about children is based on assumptions. And we're learning so much more about the brain and about the capabilities of children that it's good to kind of shake up those assumptions with evidence of what we have now. So one of the stories she told was this. He said, what I now like to do is just try and help parents right at the beginning to understand how ready to relate their baby is when they arrive. He says, so what I do is this. With their permission, he picks their baby up and he holds the baby. So this would be, in early days, holds the baby.
Yeah, hours often, isn't it?
Yeah. Just supporting the head gently. And he talks, okay, and he stands like this with the mother. So you're the mother for the purposes of this exercise. Okay? What happens is that he just gets a conversation going, and then he says, and now I want you to start speaking to the mum. Just start saying anything. Just speak the baby's name, just say some things. And he says, and without fail, the baby will turn her head towards the mother. He says, it never fails. He says, I like to do this because I want the parent to understand that this baby is born ready to relate. She already knows your voice by the time he's hours and days old. And it's just such a great idea. And of course, everybody in the audience is going, do you do it with fathers? We're modern people. Because he says, I do it with fathers. He says, it works about 3 or 4 times out of 5, and then the other one I turn the head. He's a kind of scientist.
And actually, my sort of thinking about this has really been moved on by somebody who had been around for a long time, and that's my mum. I think she just walked in, actually. I'm going to embarrass her for the second time today, actually. Because I was chatting to my mum, I actually call this the Joyce Minnis hypothesis. Because I was chatting with a cup of tea to my mum a couple of months ago, and she said, do you realise that the rates of violence have reduced in Britain over the last few decades? And she said, I think that's because we treat our children better. And I mean, typical kind of scientist, I was like, okay, what's your evidence? And she said, well, I was a social worker for, several decades in the west of Scotland, and, we actually treat our children a lot better than we used to before. And the example that she particularly gave was that she was part of a group of mothers back in the 60s and 70s who fought very hard to be allowed to go and visit their children when they were in hospital. I was actually telling this story, oddly enough, this morning at a Quaker meeting in Glasgow, and somebody came up to me, an elderly woman, and said, yes, I was in hospital with scarlet fever for 3 months as a child and nobody visited me. You just think, how? You just think, how could we have treated children like that? It just seems like an absolute no-brainer. When you're sick, you want your mum, you want your dad. So we have moved on in an understanding of looking after children, and I think my mum's probably right that might be something to do with the reason that we're not as violent. obviously we've got a long way to go. You know, we've still got a lot of abuse and neglect around. And what we know scientifically now is that what Graham was talking about, what Barry Bratherton was talking about, that early parent-infant interaction, or it can be grandparent-infant interaction or big sister-infant interaction, is absolutely crucial for brain development. So the eye contact that you've got, the verbal interaction, is actually forming the brain. So, for example, there's a wonderful developmental psychologist from Edinburgh called Colwyn Trevarthen, who has shown that what they call motherese, but it could just as easily be grandfatherese, is so rhythmic that you can actually put it on a musical score. You can actually score it on a musical score. So, for example, when you see a baby go on a bus, go, eh, the parent goes, ah, it's right on time. And when things go wrong, it's because it's not right on time. So if somebody, for example, if a parent has problems with drug misuse or severe mental health problems and they're just not able to really respond, then what we now know is that there'll be problems, and there'll be particular problems in brain development in the areas that grow really rapidly after birth. So the first 4 weeks or so are particularly fertile for just brain growth, and then a few months, you know, you continue to get this incredible neuronal connecting all over, and then you start to get what we call pruning, which is where you get kind of use-dependent sculpting really of the brain. So, for example, one of the most amazing things I remember hearing when I learned about developmental psychology is that in the first few weeks and months of life, a baby will turn his or her head towards the syllables of any language. But then after a few weeks, they'll only start to turn towards their own language, which is why English people find it very hard to read, and Chinese people find it very hard to say L, because you lose the ability to use it, use it or lose it. And then the other parts of the brain that are the parts of the brain that are particularly susceptible to not having that early interaction are the ones that are really rapidly developing and that have got lots of receptors for stress hormones. So stress is really important for young babies as well. And as I've worked more and more with parents and children, I've started thinking that one of the really crucial roles of a parent is just to soothe their children. It's to keep their stress responses within a kind of tolerance band. It's not just soothing though, it's also, I mean, if you see a young child sitting, watching Teletubbies, or actually as my daughter does at the moment, she watches anime for hours. And you just know you've got to get her to turn it off and go and do something that will actually get her more animated. But then if your children are too high, you want to calm them down. And actually what you're doing is you're keeping the stress hormones within a kind of tolerance band, because if you don't, it's actually toxic to the brain.
There's this lovely idea that we now use quite a lot in our work, which is called the circle of security, and it's like any really good theory. It is elegantly simple and explains a whole lot. And basically, it talks about the idea as a child, and we're now thinking when a child's a wee bit older, beginning to toddle, the child begins to explore the world. And the idea of the circle is that the child is going out and exploring, and then when the child reaches the end of its kind of adventure string, it turns back, and the parent or whoever it is that's attending to them and giving them care at that point needs to be paying attention on both sides of the circle. In other words, they need to take delight in the child going out in adventurous, oh look what you've found, and also be available when the child comes back in to welcome them back, to soothe them if they've been upset. And why I mention it is there's this particularly important role in helping the child to organise their feelings, to make sense of the world, because a lot of the time the child will have experienced things that it hasn't got a template for, has no experience of, and so a bit kind of mixed up and confused about it. And one of the roles of the parent is just helping the child to kind of make sense of that, talking it through. What did you do? What did you see? What did you find? That kind of stuff. And that idea of the circle is a very nice one that we find very useful in our work. I was going to sort of step back though for a minute, because there's, I don't know, how we talk about these things, I think is really important. And I read something in The Guardian last week. I can tell I was on holiday, you know. And I read The Guardian. And it was a column by a woman called Zoe Williams, and she was talking about the Centre, is it Centre for Social, no, what is it? You know, the Ian Duncan Smith thing? Centre for Social, it's not Justice, is it? Well, that's the irony, you see. I think it actually, or is it social engineering? Anyway, she was talking about that. And the fact that in their manifesto, which they produced a few years ago now, they reproduced this slide, which I don't know whether there's any chance you'll have come across it. I used to use it in some of my presentations when I was talking about the work we do, but I've stopped doing it for reasons that might become obvious. But basically, it's kind of like X-rays of brains, except if you X-ray brains, you don't really see anything. So it's actually MRIs of brains, brain scans. And on one side is a kind of, one's bigger than the other, basically, and the other looks a wee bit kind of, you know, dried up and walnut-like. This is meant to represent the brain of a healthy 3-year-old and the brain of a 3-year-old who's experienced severe neglect. Okay. Now, it kind of, you know, there's a truth to this, you know, along the lines that Helen's been talking about, and that is that children's brains grow according to their use, how they're developed is affected by what they experience. And so in some cases where children have been grossly neglected, for example, children have been brought up in institutions like Romanian orphans and so on, you can get these terrible things happening. But I stopped using it because it seems to me to be too horrible and have a kind of counterproductive melodramatic effect when you're trying to make a point. But the reason that she talked about it was because she was accusing Ian Duncan Smith of trying to foster the idea of an educational underclass, and that this educational underclass that we're growing is there because of feckless parents. So I'm more than happy to repeat her concern, because I think when we do talk about these things, we have to be very, very careful that we're not getting into the business of either stupid caricatures or creating social division or ideas of an underclass. Okay, so I want to just throw that out there. And
I just got it, but we're actually agreeing, because I stopped using that slide as well, and I stopped using that slide when I was talking to an adoptive parent who mentioned that she'd seen this slide in somebody else's presentation, and she was the mother of a wee boy who'd been adopted by her at the age of 2, I think, after he'd been in foster care since the age of 6 weeks. But when he went into foster care at 6 weeks, he was literally, starving and covered in sores, so a lot has happened in his first 6 weeks, and he had a lot of problems. And she just couldn't bear it. She said it was absolutely unbearable thinking that might be the brain of her child. She actually had to run out. And I suppose, for me, there's 2 things. I mean, I did a bit more investigation and I discovered that actually, originally, there were 3 brains in that slide. There was the brain of the kind of sadly more ordinarily neglected child, which looks exactly like the brain of any of us. The really extreme ones that you described so well, were like a sort of shriveled walnut, were children who, for example, had been kept in the dark in their own feces, really feral children, which, thank God, are extremely rare. But for me, the other side of humans and brain development is that actually they've discovered recently, neuroscientists have discovered over the last few years that we can continue making new brain cells and making new brain connections right up until death. So even in very elderly people, you can be actually creating new connections, and I find that very optimistic. There's been a lot of work over the last few years searching for a critical period in child development. And there are 1 or 2. So, for example, we know that if a child is born with bilateral cataracts, then unless those cataracts are removed in the first, I think, 8 weeks, the child will be blind, because the development of the optic nerve is dependent on the light and the stimulation that's coming in from the environment. So people have thought, oh my goodness, is that the same with attachment? And it doesn't seem to be, actually. So it seems to be possible for change to happen. I mean, otherwise we wouldn't do our work. It's probably harder the older you get. But I think one of the other really, the other kind of periods of real possibility is adolescence. Because we know that there are two periods of brain development where things are really happening. And one is the first few weeks and months of life, and the other is adolescence, where you're myelinating. And the way I like to think of myelinating, you're putting a sheath on the brain cells and the long brain connections. It's a bit like cladding, it's a bit like getting your pipes cladded. And I think that's probably why you can have a really articulate 12-year-old boy who suddenly gets to 13 and the hormones start pumping and all he can say is, because he's busy cladding. That's the point where change can happen. So sorry, I interjected there.
That's all right. I'm going to talk a wee bit about why the sort of policy people are so excited about this, just for a wee minute. So when Karen McCluskey spoke here, Karen McCluskey is from the Violence Reduction Unit of what was Strathclyde Police, but Police Scotland, I guess. And I think one of the most fascinating things that's happened in the last 10 years is that some of the people who have been leading the move to think more about the earliest days of life have been the police. You know, John Carnahan, who set that unit up, and Karen, who now took over from John when he retired, they go around talking, among other things, about the importance of early years. And what is it they're talking about? They're talking about trying to support parents in vulnerable families to relate to their children. Okay. And another slide that, if you keep that sort of company, you're almost bound to have seen, is a slide produced by a guy called James Heckman. And essentially what that slide shows is it maps social benefit versus investment at different ages. And it goes like that. If graphs mean nothing to many people, and I'm sorry, but it goes like that. So to those of you to whom graphs mean a lot, you'll be going, oh. But essentially what that suggests is that the return for your investment falls off steadily as with the passing years, or to put it crudely, you get a bigger bang for your buck the earlier you spend it. And so these people like Karen McCluskey and others, the police, are urging the Scottish Government to invest in early years. Harry Burns, who is the Chief Medical Officer, when he did his presentation here, he did this very interesting thing where he essentially his perennial quest is, why is it that people in Scotland are so unhealthy? You know, I suppose that's a reasonable question for the Chief Medical Officer. You know? And what's fascinating is that Harry, you know, he's been in the post for about, I don't know, 6, 7 years, something like that, is that for the last half of that, he's just been talking about relationships. He's been talking about relationships of two sorts. One is community level. He's just very interested now in community development and sort of reconnections within community. And the other is parent-infant relationships. And actually, he talked about our work when he was talking about that here. So the question I think we have to think about is, well, what is it that parents need to be able to do to make it so that it's good for them and their children? So that's what I think we'll try and go in and say a wee bit more about.
I mean, just before you do, Graham, when you were talking about the brain scan picture, it sparked, and the possibility that the Westminster government are thinking that might be to do with feckless parents. it made me think that it is wider than just the parent-infant relationship as well. It's to do with communities, and it reminded me of a paper that a friend of ours, Phil Wilson, gave to me a few months ago, that was actually written in the early 80s by a fantastic psychologist called Barbara Tizard. And what she did was she got 3-year-old girls in nurseries, and she put little frocks on with a microphone, and so that she could actually record their conversation and the conversation of other people back to them. And she had a paper about the conversation back, and she had a paper about their conversation. And the paper about their conversation is about why questions. And you'll know if any of you have been mothers of 3-year-olds, I mean, they just ask why. And what she found was really striking, that she looked at working class mothers and infants and middle class mothers and infants, and when they wore their little pinafores at home, they all asked the same number of why questions. But when they got to nursery, the working class kids didn't ask as many why questions. And it just makes me think, my goodness, what's that about? Is there something about our society that's actually dampening down certain sections of kids? And so this is something that we all need to be thinking about. You know, we need to be thinking about really drawing children out and allowing them to speak and giving them their voice. You know, really from very early on. And I think it's probably going to be really important in reducing those inequalities if we do that.
So I think one of the ideas that is kind of core to all of this is this idea called attunement. And Helen has a lovely photograph that appears in some of her presentations to illustrate the idea of attunement. That was a baby right on cue. Sorry.
My dad and my daughter.
And of Helen's dad and daughter. Looking at, is that a piece of sausage or something like that?
Yeah, it's lovely. They're sitting at a barbecue, and my daughter was about, she must have been about 7 or 8 months, so she was sitting on my dad's knee, and my dad's obviously talking. And what you see is all 5 senses involved in what Daniel Stern called an attunement dance. So there's eye contact, there's verbal interaction, and because they're sharing the sausage, and there's physical interaction as well. They even share and taste and smell.
So this thing called attunement is just so immensely important. And there was a piece of work that we were involved in a number of years ago, and a colleague of ours called Christine Buckering, might be known some of you, did some work for Scottish Government about infant mental health. And one of the things that they put in the recommendation, and which it was funny because it was picked up by a lot of people and sort of went, how important is that, for goodness sake? And what Christine had recommended was that people put small babies in backward-facing buggies. In other words, the baby's looking at the parent. And I guess there was a tradition for, you know how in Scotland we take great pride in having Weans with bright red faces in the winter, and I was like that because they're getting wheeled around the streets. I took the Wean out for a walk. But the idea is not so much to protect them from the weather, but to give them the opportunity to see what they really need to see, and this is attunement we're talking about. So the most vivid and important sight that a child in the earliest days can see is the face of an adult who's interested in them and doing that dance thing. And in a sense, it's why I love the metaphor that Daniel Stern uses about attunement dance. It's how the child learns reciprocity, give and take, come and go, and it's if you like, it's the rhythm of relationships. And so backward facing buggies or these carry things are great things for kids. It's not that putting your child facing out is a bad thing, you know.
No, because you're probably going to have a cup of tea and sit and talk to them there, so
yeah. But you know, to make sure that the child is facing the right way is going to be a really important thing.
And I think it reminds me also that different cultures have got different ways of doing it. I mean, the same daughter, my older daughter, is very feisty. My younger sister's there and she's had to put up with it all her life. And she was a particularly kind of unsettled baby. She didn't know night from day, she didn't want to eat when you were ready to eat. And she's very lucky because she's got a godmother from Zimbabwe, and the wonderful Marina Hudson came up to stay with me when Ellie was about 6 weeks old, and I was like yellow, and Steve was grey. And she said, Helen, you've got to put her on your back. She said, you put her on your back, you get your hands free, she says in her inimitable way, you can piss and shit and cook chips. And your hands free. And you know, I tried it. You know, I basically put, you'll have seen women doing this, you put a sarong round and you knocked it, I put it in because I was a bit of a nervous snot. And you can see the wee face there. And my blood pressure just went, choo. And the lovely thing is, my world was being shared by, you know, we were actually sharing it, and we could kind of chat. And I've got a good friend in London who's of Nigerian parents, and she says she was carrying like that until she was probably 2.5, and she remembers it. She says she remembers the sight of her mum doing the washing up and things, and it's just a different way of doing it.
It's maybe, we should maybe name check Jane Bowlby. As he was known in later years. Nobody ever understood that career change. Sorry, John Bowlby. So John Bowlby was he was also a child psychiatrist, and but a lot of he spent a lot of time in Africa when he was younger, and one of the things that he kind of observed was just that we had developed in Britain a culture where children were not connected to you physically nearly so much.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anyway, the reason I wanted to go back to attunement was that, just picking up something you said earlier on, Helen, and is this Christine's work that I'm going to talk about? There's a study about maternal depression, which, which indicates that if you look at babies in the earliest days, they'll initiate the dance, you know. They will kind of make the noises, you know, and that stuff. And one of the things that can happen where, in this case a study of women who are depressed, where the mothers are very depressed and not responding, is that after a while the baby stops signalling. And so if you then, just a wee aside on crusading messages for any psychiatrists that are in the room, it's why treating relationships is important, okay? It's not just about the drugs. Hobby horse part is that if you address the depression and you know the woman recovers a better mood and becomes more activated, that doesn't necessarily return automatically. You have to work at it. And that is a really important finding. And it just points to that thing that Helen talked about earlier on, about how the way the brain is used grows into the way the brain grows. And so there's some lovely work that's been done by this woman that we know in America called Mary Dozier, who has demonstrated that if children are so unfortunate as to not to be able to stay with their parents because their parents aren't looking after them well enough and they go into foster care, which can be a really, really positive, life-affirming thing to do, by the way, then many of those children, when they arrive in foster care, will be like that child who's given up signalling. And one of the things that is really important that the foster carer does is that they don't give up the idea that this is a child who can dance. And so they start to dance with the child. And there's this lovely thing, I think, Mary Dozier has demonstrated it very nicely, that if a child is went to foster care, probably under the age of 12 months, then that will recover very quickly. And the child will then be able to dance, if you like, to relate in a very comfortable and ordinary way. But some children, even by that age, and many children who are a bit older, will not do that naturally. And the foster carer has to then kind of hold on to the idea that that child, to follow this metaphor, could be a dancer. That child has the capacity to dance, but I've got to work to mobilise it. And we use this idea of responding to what you know the child needs rather than what the child just signals. Because by that time, children will sometimes have developed not just a loss of the dancing style, but also other coping styles, because they've lived usually in a stressful environment, and so they will have developed ways of coping with that stress, which usually involve avoiding the stress-giving relationship. So one of the important things that foster parents need to learn, and many of them do it absolutely brilliantly, is how to overcome the child's avoidance and teach them, again in that metaphor, to dance again, and those children then recover the ability to experience attunement. And it is very, very life-giving and very good for their future that they can do that.
And you know, Christine Puckering, who's a colleague of ours, who developed an intervention called Melon Babies, which is aimed at very vulnerable families who struggled with that. She did her first pilot of Melon Babies, and I was very lucky to be working at the same corridor as her at the time. And she ran in this day and she said, "Helen, it's amazing! It works!" And I'm like, "What?" And she said, "This mum said to me," and basically they'd be doing baby massage and doing various techniques to try and help the babies learn to dance. And the mum said, "It works, it's amazing. I'm not depressed anymore. You've helped me fall back in love with my baby and I feel better." So it's a beautiful two-way dance. To say it takes two to tango. So basically as the babies warm up, often mums can warm up again. And that's very much what Graham's work's all about at the moment, is actually trying to help families fall back in love with their children and warm that relationship back up.
So I say we've got how are we doing for time?
25. There's nothing on after, so.
Hey, say we've got about millions.
Yeah.
So there's this funny thing happened. So Helen and I have both been working in Glasgow for a while, and I've been working. So we're both child psychiatrists, but I'm a clinician and Helen's a researcher, and it doesn't mean that Helen doesn't do any work with real people, and it doesn't mean that I've got no interest in research, but you know, slightly different emphases in our work. And Helen had come into her post and started to do research around attachment. Your area of interest, you know this of course. I'm telling them in case they don't.
Yeah, no, it's okay. Well, why don't I tell this a little bit then? So basically I came across a paper by a guy called Charlie Zena, who was, I suppose I was always interested in what happens to the children that haven't got enough, so the maltreated, abused and neglected children. And a group in New Orleans had developed a programme, basically led by Charlie Zena and Julie LaRue, who's a psychologist, where every child who comes into an episode of foster care who's been maltreated, who's under the age of 5, so the young ones, would come into their team, and basically they would get a really detailed assessment of the relationship, and then the birth family would get an intervention, and the whole purpose was to try and help the birth family change, to try and basically change enough to get the child back. I mean, I don't know if you want to take over at that point and talk a bit about.
Well, so Helen has an amazing capacity to make things happen, so she managed to get Charlie to come to Glasgow.
I had to beg for a couple of years, but eventually I had.
So he came to Glasgow, and our team were there. By this time, I'd been working in a team, children's mental health team, with children who were in care, you know, in foster care and things like that. And we were thinking, you know, a lot of our work was with 13, 14, 17-year-olds who were just in a real kind of pickle, you know, and it's never too late to do a good job, right? Never too late to do a good job. But what you can do at different times varies, you know, you can, and one of the things that we've been thinking about in our team was these children who are 13, 14 and in a real pickle were often known, their families were often known by the time the children were a couple of years old. You know, the children might have actually been in foster care for 6 months when they were 2, and we were thinking, how come we've kind of not managed to get this all onto a different path for these children, that their lives are still in such distress and difficulty. So we began to think, you know, can we all do something earlier? You know, it's the kind of thing we do.
And believe me, it's one of the things that, I mean, I've thought it's a no-brainer that we should be intervening early for years, but trying to change services is very difficult, because if you've got, say you've got a psychotic 14-year-old who's out in the community thinking about killing his father, I I mean, you're going to put your emphasis on that. So it's quite hard to get people to think, no, we actually do to shift funds and people.
So we were all kind of, our team and Helen's team and another team in social work with a colleague called Tina Cunningham, we're kind of all meeting up from time to time to scratch our heads and say, look, how do we do this? And when Helen managed to get Charlie to come to Glasgow, we all piled in, you know. And then with the upshot of that was that we began to kind of work with them and say, look, we would like to do here what you're doing there if we can. And at the end of a meeting one day we'd had about this, Helen said to me, oh, do you know, I thought I should tell you, I've applied for a Churchill Fellowship.
And Graham, you've just got to imagine the scene, Graham went with us. Because he had also applied for a Churchill Fellowship, and we both applied to go to New Orleans, and we thought there's absolutely no way we're going to fund both of us.
So I should just do a quick plug for Churchill Fellowships. If you've never heard of them, you should go on the website. It's one of the good things that Winston Churchill's estate does, is it gives people the opportunity to go and look at something interesting and maybe important, sort of serious. So we both had to go down to London and persuade them that what we wanted to do was a good thing, and they thought it was, and we both got to go.
So he said he was going to go in and learn about the intervention, and I said I was going to learn about how to make these changes. And so we had a different focus, but to cut a long story short with that, it was me and Graham and Anne, who's in the audience, Graham's wife, in this absolutely lovely house in the Garden District, and we played a bit of music as well, just in case you thought we didn't ever get jollies in this world. Yeah. But it's been the most ridiculous amount of hard work since we got back. But we've got the council and the NHS, and we've got SPCC, who are very, very heavily involved, who are funding the intervention, and they're also funding some of the research, and the university. And we've got this absolutely crazy situation in some ways where we've got an randomised controlled trial, so that basically children in Glasgow who've been maltreated and come into an episode of care, if their family are willing, they'll be randomly allocated either to very good social work, which is called the Family Assessment and Contact Service, or the Glasgow Different Family Team, which is Green's team. And they've got a slightly different ethos, but basically all getting a really good assessment and good recommendations about whether the child should go home to the birth family or whether they should be adopted. And we're right in the middle of that, so if you ask us back in a couple of years, we can maybe tell you whether it works.
It's maybe worth saying actually, because the places where someone stands up and says, we have really great social work services are pretty few and far between. Mainly social work is either not talked about or slaughtered in the media. We have great social work services.
Very, very forward thinking.
Yeah. Do they work well? Not all the time, because they're under-resourced and have got vastly over-demanded services. And sometimes they're managed by people who are just hopeless, you know, as in all of life. So that's just a wee plug for social work. Good on them. Some of my best friends are social workers.
And it's worth saying that one of the reasons we think it's worth doing this as a trial is because they don't have that in New Orleans. So we're very lucky. I mean, in most of the United States, you know, if you're a maltreated child, if you get a service, great, and if you don't, I mean, you know, nobody may be noticing because they don't have good preventative social work. So it may well be that the way we do it in Scotland is actually just as good as the way they do it in New Orleans. So that really, in some ways, is a question, isn't it?
But what's really interesting from the point of view of a practitioner is that at the moment we're getting the opportunity to work with these families who generally have not had anyone able to take the time that we're able to take with them. And so we spend hours with these parents just asking them all about our lives. And it kind of echoes again and again in what we experience in working with these families, because we invite, just very briefly, what we do is we meet the children with their foster parents first, just to make sure that that's going well. And most of the time it is. Sometimes foster parents and kids are not quite on the same dance floor, and you have to kind of help to get that going well. And then we invite the parents in, we get to know them a wee bit, and then we bring the parent and the child together, and we use a couple of very sort of specific assessments, including one which is a lovely thing. It's a play-based thing, And we kind of talk the parents through how we're going to do it. And you just see some amazing things. I mean, you see some really sad things. You see some parents who are just clearly not used to playing with their children at all. You know, it starts off with giving them a bucket of great toys in 10 minutes just to play together. And some parents don't know what to do. And then there's some tasks built in that are just wee tests of the relationship. And again, some parents just don't know what to do and how to handle it. And it's borne in on me every time I watch this. No one has shown them, no one has helped them with these struggles. So what we've got, I think, are lots and lots of families, and I'm extending from our experience, that might or might not be reasonable, you can see what you think, who might be able to do a whole lot better by their kids if the investment and the time and people was there. And that's really what we're looking at.
I mean, I think the other thing that's really, really interesting is what that I think I've really learned is that 99 times out of 100, more than that, people want the best out of it. They want the best for their kids. They might not know how to do it, or they might actually be actively misguided, but they're generally doing their best. And so that's something that we can always capitalise on. And I remember, maybe just to finish, remember hearing Alan South, who's a fantastic attachment researcher, and he said, we can't expect parents to support children unless we support parents. So in some ways I think that's maybe a good way to leave it and just really open it out for questions. If anybody wants to ask or comment, you can say, yeah, rubbish.
No, I don't think it's a new idea, because I worked maybe 5 years ago at a project over at the centre, and the theory was
fantastic place
to work with parents, and unlike out in the area teams, there was time and there was a bit of money.
Yeah.
But I tell you, there was a lot of resistance with a commitment to it eventually, and with long-term work, it's a dirty word, you have to fix everything in 6 weeks. So I think I don't disagree with anything you've said, but I'm a bit sceptical that the resources will ever be put in the way they need to do that kind of work over a prolonged period. And they like looking at projects that test the work out, but then to put in the funds and the resources, maybe they will.
I think if there's one thing that's changed, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, there's been some really, really wonderful work, and I do remember the Overmeeting Centre. I think one of the things that has changed is that some of the most surprising people now do understand what there is to a baby, whereas I think they didn't before. You've got John the policeman, and he looks like a big policeman, going round and talking about the importance of babies, and you've got the chief medical officer going round, I'm pleased to say that child psychiatry is the most important medical discipline. And we used to feel like the poor sister, we really did, in medicine, we're not real doctors and we're certainly not real scientists. And that's changed. So it takes a long time. It's taken, I think it's taken a number of decades for the rate of violence to start to reduce, and we've still got a long way to go. There's a question on that.
I've kind of come across triple P classes, and I was just wondering, with your line of work, have you ever kind of come across them? What your experience has been?
Yeah. Triple P is a parenting intervention that's got lots of different kind of levels. So there's kind of one-to-one for a sort of more intensive level, but there's also kind of big kind of public health chats that you can have about it. And it's that kind of intervention's got very good evidence base, because it's basically about I suppose it's based on good strong psychology. I suppose my own view is that Triple P is very good in many circumstances, but it's not the be-all and end-all, because some vulnerable families really need to look in much more depth about their own experience of parenting, which is something that you wouldn't get in a Triple P class. So for me, I think there's actually there's room for lots of different kinds of ways of supporting parents. And I don't know if you get into that on that.
No, I would agree. There's a lovely thing in circle security. This is not the you think Triple B good, wait till you see something. It's not like that. There is this lovely thing that they use in Circle Security where they show a video with some lovely music, pastoral music or some groovy music, as you kind of follow a path down, kind of through the sand dunes and down onto the beach. And then they show you it again, and just as you kind of get down there, you hear music from Jaws, and they use this metaphor of sharp music to talk about how, for some people, very ordinary experiences that everyone else experiences as pleasurable have very difficult connotations. And that's what Helen's talking about. There's lots of individuals, many of us, who will have had aversive or traumatic experiences in their lives. And simple things like a child depending on you absolutely will mobilise something that sets off the sharp music. And so there has to be a way of working with someone where that happens for them. And so just an educational programme, you often need a little bit more than that. But the range of programmes is brilliant, yeah.
I mean, certainly, when I was bringing up my kids, when my kids were very young, just the very basic bit of learning that good psychologists taught us, and the kind of thing that you would get in Triple P, that if a child's kicking off, it's actually better to just ignore that. Was just fantastic. Such a godsend. So, really that kind of stuff for your average, for kind of 90% of us in the middle range, it's just great. There's lots of it on the web, and I would really recommend it. I think we could all do with a good parenting manual, to be honest. Especially because we don't live in extended families generally these days, where you've got your mum that can say, "Look, just walk away."
Have you been to visit nurture groups and see what they're doing?
Wonderful. Glasgow is an absolute in Scotland. It's a great place to be in terms of this, and I mean, you'll probably, I suspect I'm speaking to someone who knows what I'm talking about, but Glasgow did this fantastic kind of quasi-experimental study. We've introduced nurture groups, which are basically places where kids that are struggling get extra nurture in school. And the great thing is, it's changed the whole ethos of primary schools, hasn't it? And it's increased both emotional behavioural functioning, but also attainment.
Well, I think Glasgow put money in Camilla Nursery City, so I'm trying to what's next.
So what was that?
Glasgow, the council are putting money in Camilla Nursery City.
Oh, it's
So
fantastic.
they're going to
And they're trying to get it into secondary schools. It's tougher in secondary
just started in
schools.
some secondary schools, and it's also in nursery schools as well.
It's wonderful. And I think, back to your first question, that for me, I mean, nurture used to be a dirty word, and it's certainly in education. Love, oh God, and I was talking at a big day about nurture groups in Falkirk just a few months ago. The word love must come about 100 times. It's fine. We're not talking about sexual love, we're talking about caring about people, and it really does help us. So I do think society's moved on, and I think we're continuing to move.
We should probably think of winding up. That's a nice link into our final song.
Yeah, that was unintentional.
Just while you're cheering up, Bryce, I should say a few things. The Philosophy Cafe will be on tomorrow night, and the Philosophy Cafe is usually Ethan tries to link it. So his question tomorrow night is there such a thing as human nature? So if you're interested in taking that any further, the Philosophy Cafe will be in here at, I think, 8 o'clock, 8:15 tomorrow. Next month we've got Jim Mitchell from Strathclyde University and Jerry Hassan, who the Glasgow Herald always described as Scotland's leading intellectual. Jerry. Jerry loves to he milks that one. So the title that they chose is After Independence, which Jerry said is a sort of cheeky title. Basically, they want you to think about what's going to happen after the referendum, no matter how we vote, yes or no. What are the possible options for us then, If we fancy yes and we get no, are we fucked, or is there some other way to think about things? I guess it'll be that type of area. So, thanks again to Rob. Rob, did we get the film okay? So we'll put that up on YouTube. So if you want to relive this for any reason, we'll stick it on YouTube. Just look for Glad Academy. And I want to thank you all for coming. But especially, I think, even though I didn't feel there was much development of the testicle idea. I think otherwise,
Private later.
okay. Otherwise I think we loved that, didn't we? So, big round of applause. So what are you doing here?
I think audience participation is required, so you'll know this. It's Loves Me Like a Rock. And some people will naturally want to sing the tune. And if you naturally want to sing the tune, sing with me. And some people will naturally want to put in the backing vocals. It's great backing vocals. What I want to do, this is a Paul Simon song, but forget about Paul Simon. Get a gospel feel here, okay? This is a hymn, we'll get gospel. So if you want to sing the backing vocals, and wavy arms are very acceptable, then sing with these guys. Testify! When I was a little boy,
When I was just a boy,
and the devil called my name,
when I was just a boy,
I'd say, who do you think you're fooling?
when I was just a boy,
I'm a consecrated boy.
when I was just a boy,
I'm singing with the Sunday choir. Oh, my mama loves me. She loves me. She gets down on her knees and hurry, 'cause she loves me like a rock. She loves me like the rock of ages. She loves me. She loves me, love me, love me, love me. When I was born to be a man,
oh, to be a man,
the devil called my name.
oh, to be a man,
I'd say, who do you think you're fooling?
oh, to be a man,
I'm a consecrated man.
oh, to be a man,
Such a purity. My mother loves me. She loves me. She gets down on her knees and hugs me, 'cause she loves me like a rock. She loves me like a rock of ages. She loves me. She loves me, loves me, loves me, loves me. If I was a president,
was the president,
the Congress called my name,
was the president,
I'd say, who do you think you're fooling?
was the president,
I got the presidential suit.
was the president,
I'm on the presidential podium. Oh, my mother loves me. She loves me. She gets down on her knees and hugs me, 'cause she loves me like a rock. She loves me like a rock of ages. She loves me. She loves me, love me, love me, love me.
love me like a rock,
Love me, love me, love me, love me.
love me like a rock, love me like a rock,
She loves me like a rock.
love me like a rock,
Love me like a rock.
love me like a rock,
Love me like a rock.
love me like a rock, so
Love me
crazy,
like a rock.
love me like a rock.
Thanks a lot. So next one's 13th of October. We're actually not sure what it's going to be. It's so stout next month that I think it can't be in here, so we might do it across the road at the shed, but I don't know. We'll have to ask them. Does that make a big front room? So we'll put it in the poster outside and we'll put it on the Facebook and the usual sort of way. Right, thanks a lot.